The air inside the brand-new showroom of Blackwood Implement hung thick and clean, a sterile mix of fresh paint, curing rubber, and the faint, sweet smell of diesel that hadn't yet been burned. It was the smell of progress, the smell of 1973. Outside, the August sun beat down on the gravel lot, making the rows of green and yellow machinery shimmer like a mirage. But inside, under the silent hum of the central air conditioning, Jedediah Stone felt a cold knot tightening in his gut. He stood before the desk of Silas Blackwood, a man whose hands had never known the particular sting of baling twine cutting into sweaty skin. Silas leaned back in his leather chair, a throne of stitched cowhide from which he ruled his little kingdom of iron and credit. A polished nameplate on his sprawling oak desk read Silas Blackwood, President. President of what? Jed wondered. Selling other men's machines to other men with the bank's money. "Let me be sure I understand you, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice smooth as engine oil. He steepled his fingers, the manicured nails a stark contrast to Jed's own, which were permanently underlined with the black grease of a lifetime's repairs. "You want to walk in here today and purchase, outright, 6 brand-new John Deere 44 or 30s, with cash." Jed nodded, his gaze steady. He was a man carved from the same stubborn soil he worked. His face was a roadmap of dry seasons and hard freezes, his eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. He'd worn his good denim overalls, the ones without patches on the knees, and a clean chambray shirt. In the breast pocket, thick and heavy against his ribs, was a cashier's check from the farmer's trust and savings for $120,000. It was more money than most men in Cedar County would see in a decade of good harvests. It was the culmination of 40 years of scrimping, of saving, of running old iron until the metal itself cried for mercy. "That's the long and short of it, Silas," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. 6 tractors, the 2 with the duals you got out front, and 4 more just like 'em. And I'll take that 7700 combine you got parked by the highway, too, the one with the corn head. Silas blinked. For a moment, the smug confidence on his face flickered, replaced by something Jed couldn't quite read. It wasn't disbelief. It was suspicion. Silas leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. "Jed, a man doesn't just walk in off a farm, running 2 30-year-old farmers, and buy a fleet that could work half the county. Where did you get that kind of money?" The question hung in the air, sharp and insulting. Jed's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of his father's words from long ago, a ghost whispering in his ear. "Never owe a man a dime, boy. Debt is a leash, and the banker holds the other end." His father had lost it all in 32, and the shame of it had followed him to his grave. Jed had sworn it would never happen to him. He'd worked his 80 acres, then bought the 80 next to it, then the 160 over the ridge, all with cash earned from sweat and saved with discipline. While other men were buying new pickups and taking trips to Florida, Jed was putting sleeves and pistons in his old Farmall M for the 3rd time. "That's my business, Silas," Jed said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The money is good. The bank will tell you so. Now, are you going to sell me the equipment or not?" Silas stood up and walked to the large plate glass window that overlooked his lot. He gestured out at the gleaming green machines. "You see that, Jed? That's not just a bunch of tractors. That's the future of farming. It's about credit, about financing, about building a relationship with a dealer who can support your operation for the next 20 years. We offer service plans, financing packages through John Deere, lines of credit for parts." "I don't want a relationship," Jed cut in, his patience wearing thin as a worn-out clutch plate. "I want to buy tractors. I have the money. It's a simple transaction." Silas turned back, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "It's not that simple. An order this large. It raises questions. The company wants to know who their equipment is going to. They want to see a business plan, a projection of income. They want to see a credit history. Frankly, Jedediah, you don't have one. You've never borrowed a penny in your life. To the bank, to John Deere, you don't exist." The knot in Jed's gut turned to a hot, angry fire. He had existed every dawn for the last 40 years, pulling on his boots while the rest of the world slept. He had existed in the blistering heat of July, wrestling with a broken sickle bar, his knuckles bleeding. He had existed in the biting cold of November, his hands numb as he tried to coax a frozen engine to life. He had poured his entire life, his entire soul, into the earth. And this man in a clean shirt was telling him he didn't exist because he'd never bowed down to a banker. "So you're telling me," Jed said, pulling the check from his pocket and laying it flat on the polished desk, the numbers stark and clear, "that my money, $120,000 of real, earned American cash, is no good here?" Silas glanced at the check, then back at Jed, his expression hardening into a mask of corporate policy. "What I'm telling you is that we don't do business this way anymore. We're building modern farming operations here, Jed. We invest in farmers who are invested in the system. A man with no credit is a man with no track record. For all I know, you could be gone tomorrow. A financed customer, he's a partner. He has to make his payments. He has to succeed. We're tied together." "You're tied together by a chain," Jed shot back. "And you're holding the lock." "It's the only way it works," Silas said with finality, sitting back down. He pushed the check back across the desk with one clean finger. "I'm sorry, Jedediah. I can't sell you the equipment. Perhaps we could start smaller. A new 100-horsepower tractor, maybe. We could finance it for you, get you started on building a credit profile." Jed stared at the check, then at Silas's smug face. The air conditioning hummed, a mocking sound in the sudden, heavy silence. He had dreamed of this day, the day he would finally retire the old, aching iron and sit in a quiet, air-conditioned cab. The day his son, young Tom, wouldn't have to come home from school smelling of gear oil and exhaustion. He had played by the rules, the old rules, the rules his father had taught him. Work hard, save your money, pay your way. And now the world had changed the rules without telling him. His cash, his life's work, was worthless. He slowly picked up the check, folded it deliberately, and slid it back into his pocket. He turned and walked toward the glass door, his work boots silent on the polished floor. His reflection walked with him, a tired old farmer in a world that no longer wanted him. As his hand touched the cool steel of the door handle, he stopped. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his back to Silas Blackwood, his gaze fixed on the shimmering rows of green tractors he was not allowed to buy. "Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Put yourself in Jedediah's shoes for a moment. You've done everything right your whole life, saved every penny, and denied yourself every comfort to achieve one single goal. And then, when you finally reach it, you're told the world has changed and your life's work is no good. What goes through your mind in that exact moment? Do you give up? Do you get angry? Or does a different kind of fire get lit inside you? Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done standing there in that dealership doorway. Jed stood there for a long time, the silence stretching. Then, without turning, he spoke, his voice low and hard, a piece of flint striking steel. "You're right about one thing, Silas," he said, the words echoing in the sterile showroom. "We're not in a relationship, but we will be." He pushed the door open and stepped out into the blinding, honest heat of the August sun, leaving Silas Blackwood alone with the smell of new rubber and the ghost of a deal he was too smart to make. The drive back to the farm was a blur of familiar sights that Jed's eyes didn't truly see. The rolling hills of Cedar County, the fields of corn standing tall and green, the heat devils dancing on the blacktop. It was all just a backdrop to the storm raging inside him. The heavy cashier's check in his pocket felt less like an achievement and more like a tombstone marking the death of a dream. He wasn't just denied tractors, he was denied his place. He was an outsider in the only world he had ever known. He turned off the county road onto his own gravel lane, a plume of dust rising behind his old Ford pickup. The lane crested a small hill, and his farm spread out below him, a patchwork of well-tended fields and weathered buildings. It wasn't fancy. The barn needed a coat of paint, and the house his grandfather had built was small and unassuming. But it was his. Every splintered fence post, every square foot of soil was bought and paid for. No banker held a note on it. No man could take it from him. Until today, that had been a source of immense pride. Now it felt like a quarantine, a self-imposed isolation from the modern world. He parked the truck next to the machine shed, the big sliding doors hanging open like a gaping mouth. Inside, in the cool shadows, his old iron sat waiting, his two workhorses. The 1948 Farmel M stood nearest the door, its faded red paint peeling in spots to reveal the primer and bare metal beneath. Its narrow front wheels were caked with the soil of the bottomland field he'd cultivated that morning. Jed ran a hand over the fender, the metal warm from the ambient heat. He knew every bolt and gasket on that machine. He'd rebuilt the C248 engine in this very shed one bitter winter, his fingers so cold he could barely hold the wrenches. He knew the specific growl it made when the governor kicked in under a heavy load, the way the steering wheel vibrated in his hands, the familiar smell of its exhaust. Further back in the shadows sat the 1951 John Deere A, the Poppin' Johnny. It was more of a sentiment than a tool now. It had been his father's last tractor. Jed and his son Tom had restored it together a few years back, a project that spanned 2 summers. They'd stripped it down to the frame, sand-blasted the rust away, and laid on fresh green and yellow paint until it shone like the day it left the factory. Its 2-cylinder engine, with that iconic pop-pop-pop sound, was the heartbeat of his own youth. It was a museum piece that he still used for light work, a connection to a past that felt more real and honorable than the present. He walked over to his workbench, a massive slab of oak scarred with the gouges and oil stains of 3 generations of stones. He picked up a heavy 3/4-inch wrench, its steel worn smooth and dark from years of use. He thought of the hours, the thousands of hours he had spent out here, wrestling with stubborn, rusted bolts, fabricating parts that were no longer made, timing an engine by ear because he couldn't afford the proper tools. Every repair was a small victory, a triumph of grit and ingenuity over decay. He hadn't been just farming. He'd been fighting a war against entropy, and he had won. But the war was taking its toll. His back ached in the mornings. His hands, gnarled and powerful, were starting to stiffen. The days of easily swinging a 50-pound transmission into place were numbered. The new 4430s weren't just about more power or air conditioning. They were about survival. They were about giving his son, Tom, a future on this farm that wasn't defined by constant, back-breaking repairs. Tom was a smart kid, good with his hands like his father. But Jed wanted him to be a farmer, not a full-time mechanic. The screen door of the house slammed shut, and a moment later, Tom appeared at the machine shed door, wiping his hands on a rag. At 17, he was tall and lean, with his father's quiet nature, but his mother's easy smile. "How'd it go, Dad?" he asked, his eyes bright with an anticipation that twisted the knife in Jed's gut. Jed couldn't bring himself to look at his son. He kept his eyes on the workbench, turning the heavy wrench over and over in his hands. "He wouldn't sell 'em to us," Jed said, the words tasting like rust. Tom's smile vanished. "What? Why not? You had the money." "He said our money wasn't the right kind," Jed said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Wanted to see a credit history, said we didn't exist." Tom was silent for a long moment. He walked over to the old farmel and kicked one of the big rear tires, the rubber hard as iron. "So that's it? We just keep running this old junk until it falls apart?" The word junk hit Jed harder than any of Silas Blackwood's insults. "It's not junk, Tom," Jed said, his voice sharp. "This junk paid for every acre of this farm. It put food on your table and clothes on your back." "I know, Dad, but look at the neighbors. The Jensens just bought a new Gleaner combine. The Millers are running 2 Steigers. They're farming twice the land we are in half the time. We can't compete with this forever." "The Jensens also have a second mortgage on their farm," Jed countered, his anger rising. "And Miller's operating loan is so big the banker practically lives in his back pocket. That's not farming. That's gambling with the bank's chips." "Maybe it's the only way to play the game now," Tom said quietly. Jed finally looked at his son, and what he saw scared him more than any banker. He saw the allure of the new way, the easy credit, the gleaming paint. He saw the seed of doubt that Silas Blackwood had planted, taking root in the next generation. This wasn't just about tractors anymore. It was about the soul of his family, the foundation of everything he believed in. That night, the gossip was already spreading through the county like wildfire on a dry prairie. Jed could feel it when he went into town to the co-op for a hydraulic fitting. Men who usually greeted him with a firm handshake and a friendly nod now looked away, or worse, gave him a pitying glance. He heard snippets of conversation from the corner of the hardware store. "Heard old man Stone tried to buy 6 new deers. With cash he kept in a mattress, I bet. Blackwood laughed him right out of the place. Told him to come back when he joins the 20th century. He was a fool, a relic, a stubborn old mule who didn't understand how the world worked. The community scorn was a heavy blanket, suffocating him. He had always been respected for his independence, for his debt-free status. Now, that very same independence was being painted as ignorance. The world had turned upside down. Debt was strength, and cash was weakness. He returned to the farm long after dark, the hydraulic fitting for the farmel's leaky lift cylinder cold in his hand. He didn't go into the house. Instead, he went back to the machine shed and flicked on the single bare bulb that hung from a rafter. The light cast long, distorted shadows, making the old tractors look like sleeping beasts. He wasn't just angry anymore. The humiliation had burned away, leaving something cold and hard in its place. A resolve. Silas Blackwood had made a mistake. He hadn't just insulted a farmer. He had declared war on Jedediah Stone's entire way of life. And if Jedediah Stone was one thing, he was a fighter. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when, but he made a silent vow in the greasy, hallowed quiet of his machine shed. He would not be beaten. He would not be erased. And one way or another, he would have his tractors. The years that followed Silas Blackwood's rejection were a strange mix of prosperity and frustration for Jedediah Stone. The early 1970s roared into the American heartland, on a wave of unprecedented grain prices. The Russians, facing their own crop failures, started buying American wheat and corn in massive quantities. The deal, which came to be known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity markets into a frenzy. Prices doubled, then tripled. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts was on the radio telling farmers to get big or get out, to plant fence row to fence row. It was a boom time, a golden age for anyone willing to borrow money and bet on the future. Silas Blackwood was more than willing. His dealership became the epicenter of the boom in Cedar County. Young farmers, flush with the promise of $5 corn, lined up at his desk. Silas was no longer just a dealer. He was a kingmaker, a gatekeeper to the new prosperity. He'd expanded his showroom, built a massive new service shop, and hired half a dozen new salesmen and mechanics. He drove a new Cadillac to the Lutheran church on Sundays and bought the old Henderson place, a prime piece of bottom land that bordered Jed's own property, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers gasp. Blackwood didn't farm it himself, of course. He leased it out to one of his best customers, a young man leveraged to the hilt on a fleet of brand-new John Deere equipment. From his own fields, Jed watched the new green machines work the land next to his. He'd see the lights of the 4430s burning late into the night, their air-conditioned sound-guard cabs a quiet bubble of comfort against the noise and the dust. Meanwhile, Jed was still out there on his open-station Farmall M, eating dust in the summer and freezing in the late autumn chill. The high grain prices meant he was making more money than he ever had in his life. The profits were staggering, but he was falling behind. While his neighbors were buying up more land and expanding their operations, Jed was limited by the speed and power of his aging fleet. He could only work so many acres from sunup to sundown. The cashier's check for $120,000 went back into the bank, where it was joined by tens of thousands more. Jed was becoming a wealthy man, but only on paper. In the eyes of the community, he was a failure, a man who had missed the boat. He was the cautionary tale fathers told their sons. "Don't be like old Jed Stone," they'd say, "sitting on a pile of cash while the world passes him by." Jed ignored the talk. He worked. He and Tom put in hours that would have broken lesser men. They kept the old machines running through sheer force of will. A cracked manifold on the M was patched with furnace cement and wire. When the transmission on the John Deere A started slipping, they spent a week in the shed, their hands soaked in gear oil, replacing the worn-out clutch dogs. Jed became a master scrounger, driving for hours to salvage yards in neighboring states, hunting for obscure parts, for the discarded guts of machines that others had sent to the scrapyard. His farm became a working museum, a testament to a bygone era of mechanical endurance. But the frustration was a constant, low-grade fever. It was in the way his back seized up after a 12-hour day on the unforgiving steel seat of the Farmall. It was in the sight of his son, Tom, his face streaked with grease, trying to time the magneto on the John Deere when he should have been out with his friends. The boy never complained, but Jed saw the quiet longing in his eyes when a new tractor drove past on the county road. One sweltering afternoon in the summer of 725, Jed was at the grain elevator, waiting his turn to unload a truck full of wheat. The line was long, a parade of new, bigger trucks than his own. Silas Blackwood was there, holding court near the scales, laughing with a group of young farmers. He wasn't dressed for farming. He wore slacks and a polo shirt, looking more like a man on a golf course. "Jedediah!" Silas called out, his voice carrying over the rumble of idling diesel engines. "Still running those antiques? I'm surprised they haven't shaken themselves to pieces yet." The other farmers chuckled. Jed just nodded, not giving Silas the satisfaction of a response. "You know, it's not too late," Silas continued. walking over to Jed's truck and leaning against the fender. "Prices are good. The bank's loaning money at 7%. I could set you up with a line of equipment that would make your life a whole lot easier. You could double your acreage by next spring." "I'm doing all right, Silas," Jed said, his voice flat. "Doing all right?" Silas scoffed. "You're a millionaire sitting on a gold mine, and you're still digging with a teaspoon. You could be the biggest operator in this county if you just let go of that Depression-era thinking." Jed looked Silas square in the eye. "And I suppose you'd be happy to sell me the shovels." Silas's smile didn't falter. "That's what I do. I help men build empires. You want to keep building sand castles. That's your business." He clapped Jed on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt like a branding iron. "The offer stands, Jedediah. When you're ready to join the rest of us, my door is always open." As Silas walked away, rejoining his circle of disciples, Jed felt a familiar, cold anger. But beneath it, something else was stirring. He listened to the talk around him. The farmers weren't just talking about bushels per acre anymore. They were talking about interest rates, amortization schedules, and debt-to-asset ratios. They sounded more like accountants than farmers, and he heard something new in their voices, a nervous edge that wasn't there a year ago. A radio in the office was talking about inflation, about the price of oil, about trouble in the Middle East. That evening, Jed sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the western hills. The air was cooling, and the sounds of the farm were settling down for the night. Tom was in the barn, finishing up the chores. Jed picked up the copy of the farm journal from the small table beside his rocking chair. He flipped past the articles on new planting techniques and ads for shiny new equipment. He was looking for something else. He found it in the back, in the financial pages. A small article about the Federal Reserve and its new chairman, a man named Paul Volcker. The article spoke of a commitment to fighting inflation, of a willingness to raise interest rates to whatever level was necessary to cool the overheating economy. Most farmers would have skipped right over it. It was dry, boring stuff about banks and government policy. But Jed read every word, and then he read it again. He thought of his father, who had always told him that the trouble never starts in the fields. It starts in the banks, in the halls of government, in places far away from the honest work of the land. He looked out across his fields, the wheat stubble glowing gold in the last light of day. Then he looked over at the neighboring farm, the one Silas Blackwood owned, where the lights of a new tractor were still moving back and forth, racing the darkness. A storm was coming. It wasn't a storm of wind and rain that you could see on the horizon. It was a different kind of storm, an economic one, silent and invisible. And Jedediah Stone, the man who had been left behind, the man who was still standing on the high, dry ground of his own making, realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that he might be the only man in the county who was prepared to survive it. The first sign of trouble wasn't in the financial pages or on the evening news. It was in the sky. The summer of 1980 arrived hot and breathless, and it stayed that way. The sky over Cedar County bleached to a hazy, indifferent white. The corn, which had shot up tall and proud in the wet spring, began to curl its leaves inward by midday, a desperate, thirsty prayer for a rain that never came. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. The creek that cut through Jed's bottom land dwindled to a trickle, then vanished altogether, leaving a scar of bleached gravel and thirsty cattails. Jed watched and waited, a familiar anxiety tightening his chest. He'd seen droughts before. He knew their rhythm. But this one felt different. It felt like a judgment. All around him, the new way of farming was being put to the test. The massive center pivot irrigation rigs that had started popping up on the flatlands ran day and night, their diesel engines a constant, thirsty drone. But they were expensive to run, and they were drawing the water table down at an alarming rate. Jed had no irrigation. He had only the sky, and the sky was giving nothing. One afternoon in late July, Jed was in his shed, grinding the valves on the head of the Farmall's C248 engine. It was a preventative measure, a ritual he performed every few years. Tom was with him, carefully cleaning carbon from the pistons. The heat in the tin-roofed shed was stifling, but it was a familiar, honest heat. Suddenly, they heard the frantic sound of a pickup truck tearing down their lane, spitting gravel. It was young Mark Jensen, their neighbor to the west. He skidded to a halt, jumping out before the dust had settled. His face was pale under his sunburn. "Mr. Stone," he yelled, running into the shed. "You gotta help me. It's my 4440. The transmission, it just quit, right in the middle of the field." Jed wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "What's it doing, son?" "Nothing," Mark said, his voice cracking. "Just a grinding noise. I was pulling the big disc, trying to break up the hard pan, and it just stopped. Won't go forward, won't go back. Blackwood's service truck is out there now." Jed and Tom followed him out. From the crest of the hill, they could see it. The big John Deere 4440, a machine less than 2 years old, sat silently in the middle of a baked brown field. Next to it was the gleaming white service truck from Blackwood Implement. 2 mechanics in clean green uniforms were lying on creepers underneath it. Jed drove his old pickup over. Silas Blackwood was already there, standing with his arms crossed, watching his men work. He barely glanced at Jed. Jed walked over to the stricken tractor. It was a monster of a machine, its rear tires taller than he was. He knelt and looked underneath. He could see the mechanics struggling to disconnect the drive shaft. There was a dark pool of hydraulic fluid staining the dry earth. "Power shift's gone," one of the mechanics grunted, sliding out from under the tractor. He was a young man Jed didn't recognize. "Looks like the C3 clutch pack failed. Probably took the planetary gears with it." Silas swore under his breath. "Can you fix it here?" The mechanic shook his head. "No way. We've got to split the tractor, haul the whole rear end back to the shop. It's a week's work, minimum. If we can even get the parts, they're back-ordered." Mark Jensen looked like he was going to be sick. "A week? Silas, I've got to get this field worked. The weeds are taking over." "We'll do our best, Mark," Silas said, his voice losing some of its usual smooth confidence. He turned to the mechanic. "What's this going to run him?" The mechanic grimaced. "With parts and labor, you're probably looking at $8,000, maybe $10,000. A choked sound came from Mark's throat. $10,000. It was more than Jed had paid for his entire farm, land and all. Jed looked from the paralyzed, complex machine to Mark's terrified face, then to Silas, who was already on the truck's 2-way radio, trying to manage the fallout. The cracks were starting to show. This new iron wasn't like the old. You couldn't fix it with a wrench and a piece of baling wire. It was a closed system. When it broke, you were helpless, a prisoner of the dealer, the parts supply, and the service bill. The drought broke in late August with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what little corn had survived. The harvest was a disaster. Yields were less than half of what was expected. But the real blow came from Washington. To punish the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan, the president had declared a grain embargo. Suddenly, the biggest customer for American corn and wheat was gone. The market, which had been the foundation for all the borrowing and expansion, collapsed overnight. Corn that had been $5 a bushel was now struggling to fetch $2. The mood in Cedar County turned grim. The easy confidence of the 70s evaporated. The talk at the co-op was no longer about buying more land. It was about how to make the next payment. Foreclosure notices started appearing in the county newspaper, small print tragedies listed among the ads for livestock auctions and church bake sales. The first casualty was Mark Jensen. The $10,000 repair bill, combined with the crop failure, was the final straw. His operating loan was called in. The bank auction was held on a cold, grey day in November. Jed went, not to buy, but to watch. He saw the life's work of a family sold off, piece by piece, to strangers. He saw Mark's father, a man his own age, standing by the barn with tears silently streaming down his weathered face. And he saw Silas Blackwood, standing near the back of the crowd, his face a mask of stone. He wasn't a kingmaker anymore. He was an undertaker. The winter of 1981 was brutal, but the economic winter was worse. The Federal Reserve, in its war against inflation, had driven the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21%. Variable rate loans, which had seemed like such a good idea at 7%, were now a death sentence. Farmers who had borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy land and equipment saw their payments triple. They were drowning. Silas Blackwood's kingdom collapsed with breathtaking speed. His customers, the young lions he had financed, were going bankrupt one by one. The shiny green equipment he had sold them on credit started coming back, not on trade-ins, but on the flatbeds of repossession agents. His lot, once a symbol of progress and prosperity, became a graveyard. Rows of nearly new tractors and combines sat silent, their tires slowly losing air, a fine layer of dust dulling their paint. He couldn't sell them. No one had money, and no one could get a loan. The very system of credit that had built his empire had now turned and devoured him. John Deere Corporate wanted its money. The Farmers' Trust and Savings, the same bank that had once backed his every move, was now his greatest enemy. Jed and Tom were insulated from the storm. Their income was down, just like everyone else's, but their outgoings were a trickle, not a flood. They had no debt. They owed no man. When the hydraulic pump on the farmall finally gave out, Jed didn't call a service truck. He and Tom pulled it themselves, rebuilt it on the workbench with a $60 seal kit, and had it running again by evening. They burned wood in the stove to heat the house. They ate what they grew in their garden and the meat they raised themselves. They were living like it was 1932, and it was saving them. The community, which had once scorned Jed as a relic, now watched him with a kind of bewildered respect. He was still standing. While his neighbors' farms were being sold on the courthouse steps, Jed's 80 acres, and the 80 next to it, and the 160 over the ridge were secure. He was an island of stability in a sea of ruin. One Saturday morning in the spring of '82, Jed saw a notice in the paper that made him put down his coffee cup. It was a bankruptcy auction. The assets of Blackwood Implement, Incorporated, were to be sold by order of the court. The date was 2 weeks away. He didn't say anything to his wife or to Tom. He just folded the paper and put it in the pocket of his overalls. For nearly a decade, he had held on to the memory of that day in the showroom, the sting of Silas's condescending refusal. He had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways, a moment of triumph, of revenge. But now that it was here, he felt no joy. He just felt a deep, weary sadness for the ruin that had befallen them all. The day of the auction was cold and windy, with a sky the color of lead. The crowd was a somber gathering of broken men. Farmers whose own equipment had been sold in similar auctions stood with their hands in their pockets, their faces grim, watching the dismantling of the man who had led them down the path to ruin. The auctioneer's fast, rhythmic chant echoed off the silent, empty service bays. They sold everything: the tools, the parts inventory, the office furniture. Jed stood near the back, watching. He saw Silas Blackwood standing alone near the big plate-glass window of the showroom he had built. He looked 10 years older. His expensive suit hung on him, and his face was grey with exhaustion and defeat. He wasn't meeting anyone's eyes. He was a king in exile, watching his kingdom be dismembered. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the last and biggest item, lot 347. All right, folks, now we come to the real estate, the building and the 5 acres it sits on, a prime piece of commercial property right here on the highway. Who'll start the bidding for me? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the big steel building. No one had any money. The bank was the primary creditor, and they were just hoping to recoup a fraction of their losses. Come on, folks, don't be shy, the auctioneer pleaded. Let's start it at 50,000. Do I hear 50,000? More silence. The bankers huddled together, whispering nervously. Jed took a slow breath. He felt the weight of his father's words, the memory of 40 years of scrimping and saving, the feel of the cold steel wrench in his hand. He thought of his son, Tom, and the future he wanted to give him. This wasn't about revenge. It was about building something that would last. He raised his hand. 25,000, he said, his voice clear and steady. It cut through the silence like a saw through oak. Every head in the crowd turned to look at him. Silas Blackwood's head snapped up, his eyes locking with Jed's across the cavernous showroom. For a moment, the old arrogance flickered in his eyes, quickly replaced by sheer, uncomprehending shock. The banker, a man named Peterson, hurried over. Jedediah, that's a low-ball offer, and you know it. It's a cash offer, Mr. Peterson, Jed said calmly. Today. Not a promise. Not a loan application. Cash. The auctioneer, seeing his chance, pounced. I've got 25,000 from the man in the back. Do I hear 30? 30,000? The bankers conferred again, their faces a mixture of desperation and disgust. They had millions on the line. 25,000 was an insult, but it was also the only real money they had seen all day. Sold! The auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking down. For $25,000 to Jedediah Stone. A murmur went through the crowd. Jedediah Stone, the man Silas had laughed out of this very building, now owned it. Jed walked slowly toward the front, past the stunned faces of his neighbors. He stopped in front of Silas, who stood frozen, his face ashen. The two men looked at each other, the years of quiet animosity hanging between them in the cold air. Why, Jed? Silas whispered, his voice hoarse. After what I did? Why? Jed looked around the empty showroom, at the ghosts of the gleaming green machines that had once filled it. Because this place almost destroyed this county, Jed said, his voice low and devoid of malice. But the people here are still going to need parts. They're still going to need their equipment fixed. And my son, he's a better mechanic than I ever was. He deserves a future that isn't spent lying on his back in the dirt. Jed reached into his pocket and pulled out his checkbook. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just signed his name, his life's work distilled into a few strokes of a pen, and handed the check to the banker. He had his tractors, and the building they came in, the sign went up a month later. The bold corporate Blackwood implement was taken down, and in its place was a simple, hand-painted sign, Stone and Son Farm Supply. The change was more than just cosmetic. The business model was turned on its head. Jed and Tom didn't sell new equipment on credit. They sold parts, both new and used, salvaged from the graveyards of the farm crisis. They ran the service shop, but they didn't charge the exorbitant rates Silas had. They charged a fair wage for an honest day's work. They taught farmers how to do their own repairs, something Silas would have never dreamed of. Tom, who had grown into a quiet, capable young man, found his calling not in the fields, but in the service bay. He had a genius for diagnostics, an intuitive understanding of machinery. He could listen to an engine and tell you which lifter was sticking. He could feel a vibration and know a bearing was about to fail. He treated the old, broken-down tractors of his neighbours with the same care and respect he'd shown the family's Farmall M. The community, slowly, began to heal. The Stones shop became the heart of that healing. It was a place where a man could buy a used hydraulic cylinder for a fraction of the price of a new one, where Tom would stay late to help someone get a combine running before a rainstorm hit. Jed would often be there, sitting on an overturned bucket, drinking coffee and talking not about interest rates, but about crop rotation and soil health. The men who had once pitied him now sought his counsel. He never preached, never said, "I told you so." He just listened and offered the simple, hard-won wisdom of a man who had weathered the storm. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, a dusty, decade-old sedan pulled into the lot. An older, stooped man got out. It was Silas Blackwood. He'd lost everything and moved away. Jed heard he'd been selling insurance in the city. He walked over to Jed, his eyes downcast. "Jedediah," he said, his voice thin. I heard you bought the old Henderson place next to yours, the one I used to own. The bank sold it cheap." Jed nodded. "Land was a good price. I wanted to ask if you'd let me walk it." "One last time," Silas said. "My grandfather homesteaded that land. I was born in that old house." Jed looked at the broken man before him. He saw no trace of the arrogant king who had once reigned from a leather throne. He just saw a man mourning a lost connection to the soil. "It's your land as much as it is mine, Silas," Jed said quietly. "You go on ahead." As Silas walked slowly toward the fence row, Jed went back into the shop. Tom was there, showing a young boy, his own son, how to set the gap on a spark plug for an old John Deere A. The boy, no older than 10, was concentrating intently, his small hands mimicking his father's. Jed stopped in the doorway and watched them. The familiar smell of grease and steel filled the air. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. He saw the whole story there, in that one moment. The legacy wasn't in the land he owned, or the building, or the money in the bank. It was here, in the quiet passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. It was in the strength of a family that had bent, but had not broken. He thought back to that day in 1943, standing in the sterile showroom, feeling the sting of humiliation. He had wanted 6 new tractors. What he got instead was something far more valuable. He had found the soul of his farm, the bedrock of his beliefs, and had passed it on, intact and stronger than ever, to his son and to his son's son. The world would keep changing its rules, but the fundamental truths of hard work, of self-reliance, of living within your means, those were as timeless and as stubborn as the land itself. And on that solid ground, the House of Stone would stand forever.